Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Techno Social. Today we have Layman Pascal with us from the Integral stage. Welcome.
Howdy, guys. Good to be here.
Good to
I
have
thought
you.
when you were like, fuck it, let's do it, I thought that was the best opening.
Well, that's kind of our attitude with Techno Social. Like I always said, it's kind of a rock and roll band, but we just talk rather than playing music. And so there's a feel to it. I think we just riff and we just sometimes get explosive and crazy.
I think that's where our community has to go. Like 10, 20 years ago, there were a lot of impressive, big picture, integrative, pluralistic thinkers. They did fantastic work, but it's a little too clean, a little too institutional, a little too positive. And we've got to make it more natural, more human, more ragged, more rock and roll, more amateurish, more offensive, all that kind of stuff.
Well, precisely. It's like I was just saying, I gave a talk on Camille Paglia yesterday, and I was watching some videos of her afterwards. And she's sitting there on a talk show saying, I'm the first great female lead guitarist. I have the spirit of rock in me. I just use words rather than playing guitar. If people think I'm irreverent, if people think that I'm rude, I'm not irreverent. Oh, please. I'm just rock and roll. And I think that's exactly it. That's what, as you touched on, a lot of the theory spaces, and indeed metamodernism in particular, just feels a bit dry. Like I don't quite know where the parties are, or where the where the fun, if they are there. I haven't seen them. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's tricky because I think we need, right, obviously we need room to specialize and to have different temperaments in the community. But we do need to be able to call out where we see imbalance, to sort of like course correct each other. And a lot of the people who are into Game B and metamodernism, they have these other elements in their character. They're actually good at it in their lives. But when it comes to the philosophy and the discussions and the projects, they're a little bit too corporate,
Exactly. I feel like that what that leads me to think about is how, we are, very sadly, there's a big war happening right now between Russia and Ukraine. And what I have noticed or thought about is how we're also seeing two different narrative complexes come crashing into each other, two different informational warfare machines, two different philosophies of government even, right? Naturally, I'm a Westerner, and values like freedom and creativity are paramount to me. However, for some odd reason, the arguments of the likes of agents like Dugin, I wouldn't call him a philosopher even, he's like an agent for hire, but philosophies like his have gained some form of traction in the West, in those who within the West like to critique it. And sure enough, the West is open. It allows for critique. My question is, how can we be even more Western and somehow cut the bullshit, cut the corporate cleanliness, and reduce the argument to terms of strength and weakness? Because for all its horribleness, that's what war kind of forces us to confront. Shit gets real. And so we have to think, in what way are we actually being strong when we have some of these discussions in our circles, and in what way are we simply dithering? And I think that there's a distinction to be made between strength and dithering, and that's, I feel, a little bit what Owen is referring to when he talks about Paglia, when he talks about transgression. I don't know if you have any feelings about that.
I mean, it sort of reminds me of the question of authenticity. Now, authenticity is a little bit too clean a word even, but you've got to sort of stand with what you are and what you're doing, right? Like, even I would rather hear from somebody who says, I don't give a fuck about Ukraine, than somebody who tells me the thing they think one is supposed to say in order to sound balanced and concerned about the situation.
Touché.
Right. There's a big question, like if we're thinking, yes, there's something important about integration, right? Both for our own development and also for setting up new civilizations. Yes, but what are we integrating? Are we integrating real things, or a sort of promotional idea of the energies and things we need to integrate? So
Yeah.
unless we hear from people what's actually going on in them, what's actually authentic, what's actually in their subconscious, the energies that are actually in their bodies, if we don't hear that stuff, then we don't have it to integrate. And we end up trying to integrate artificial simulations of what's going on. And the resulting integration becomes a hollow travesty, even if integration is actually the right idea.
Would you agree with the statement that at the end of the day, it all boils down to siding with X or siding with Y, and to large memeplexes of ideas doing battle in the noosphere, and then that battle percolates down to physical reality? Like, is it really just strength and weakness? Or is there some progress?
I hesitate with the word just, always, just as a temperamental reaction in myself. It might be, but I think we have to be careful about what we think are the categories that are interacting, that we're measuring strength and weakness among, right? If we look at, say, like, let's look at some competing cultural fields or some competing narratives. You know, are we looking at an Eastern, Western, left and right thing? Are we looking at a contemporary versus a regressive earlier mode? Or are we looking at a system that governs the world that always creates the appearance of two modes, and really they're part of one system? Like, how do we know what the sides are before we decide who's strong and who's weak?
You're so right. I mean, Owen recently just brought up this idea about rock and roll and its connection to Dionysus, and how this emergence of these specific feelings in humans is not something new, is not something proper of our time. Sure, in our time, it has a little bit more technology to express itself with. However, these things are recurring in history. It is as if we are the mouth of this unconscious, and there's a certain cyclical nature to the unconscious weather.
The Dionysian connection to rock and roll interests me a lot, because I'm fascinated by Nietzsche's critique of Wagner, which is simultaneously Nietzsche's praise of Bizet. And he's trying to think the future of music in a way that's not just about quality, right? He wants to say Wagner's a genius, and I like Wagner, but that's not necessarily the kind of genius that's good for people. And the kind of genius he's thinking of that might be good for people in the future, he describes it in the Wagner case. It's going to be more military. It's going to have more drum. It's going to be more Southern, more African, more wild. And you're like, that's rock and roll. Right? And this is a guy talking from a time when classical music was the normal kind of music, but I think he could feel the kind of 20th century music that we've been reaching for and trying to create.
That's fascinating. I did not know that.
Yeah, some great passages in the later books where he does the Wagner case, and he starts to describe how Bizet compares to Wagner and what you should be looking for in the themes of art to distinguish the art that will be healthy genius as opposed to just genius.
But okay, so what is he thinking healthy? I mean, so you mentioned this militarism, and this like Southern rhythm. So there's something, I mean, Nietzsche elsewhere speaks about tempo, right? He's all about tempo and criticizing European culture for being too slow, or the Germans for being too slow relative to the French. And I guess a lot of Wagner's music is these long, slow chromaticisms that I think in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche's going, yes, this is the voice of the like agony of the world soul. But later he's going a bit like, no, not so much.
Well, he relates to Wagner most strongly when he's in his youthful romantic pagan phase. But I think as he grows older, he sort of understands a drier, warmer, he calls it halcyon a lot, kind of transformative music that has a little more control and is a little bit less. I mean, I think he thinks of Wagner as a little bit manic depressive, as a little bit too thunderous and then dropping, as something that rather than helping people to stabilize in a way that lets them feel empowered, it tends to overwhelm people or subvert them. And you get this sense of intense pagan longing for what needs to exist, but you don't necessarily get the sense that all your parts are working together really well and you can now get shit done. That's how he's thinking about health, as like an integrated operational kind of unit where you are harmonizing your parts together to the point where you're optimizing the rate of peak experiences that you have.
That's
how I would think about Nietzsche. And generally, like Nietzsche to me is a guy who's trying to figure out how you generate a civilization that maximizes peak experiences.
That's Jamie Wheel speak for Ontological Design, and I'm totally with it. It totally is. I fucking love it. Because to me, like Wagner, it's so interesting. I was thinking, we're talking about these key individuals and how their understanding of music reflects an age, right? And Wagner was indeed, he spoke about the total work of art, this total state of music as the mediator and great architecture of the peak experiences that fashion a civilization. Music as the queen of the arts is kind of the tip of that spear, therefore designs everything that follows, that is its byproduct in the rest of culture. Now, driving that forward a little bit, right? If we do a little timeline, we had Wagner and his slow music of the agony of the world soul. Then we had the militaristic rhythms of rock and roll. I mean, 50 or 70 years later after Wagner, we had World War II. And then a few years after that, the people who took up the symbol of the cross and skull bones and the leather jackets ended up being rock and roll for a reason. I feel like that there's some sort of momentum in there. But what I'm driving towards is we're getting into the age of AI, and we're getting into the age of where all of a sudden we can create total experiences without having to faff about with theory about music. We can actually fucking imprint this into people, whether they like it or not, which is horrible, but it's totally feasible.
Oh, so horrible.
It's the wrong thing to do. Or not, but shit, the premise is there. I feel like in many ways, the war that we're seeing right now and the information warfare waged by the Russians was a precursor to that. They literally did this for tactical purposes in war. And I feel like the more that we move towards the future, the more there will be space for sort of this artistic expression to emerge that articulates the means of the time. Now, the means of our time are not the orchestra, the electric guitar, or the drums, but they will be AI and the total experience of the smart home, of the smart environment, of the connected city, of you name it, peak experiences. It's coalescing. It's coalescing somehow in that direction. Do you feel this momentum towards totalization, this horrible, horrible words?
Changes of that kind are definitely underway, right? It's not totally clear how far they can go or not, right? We don't know how immersive and how totalized these things can really be, because we don't actually understand the full complexity of our bodies, our nervous systems, our electrical fields. There may be a large chunk of experience that doesn't fit into that for a long time. But definitely the system in which we're in is going to try to create that world for us because it makes us easy to harvest, right? It would be very nice for the kinds of modern capitalist systems that we have to give us fairly plausible sets of peak experiences in ways that don't cause us to be problematic to the system, right? If we could be plugged in and have these overwhelming experiences without acting them out in the world, that's almost ideal as far as they're concerned.
And yet
so we should be on guard for that, for sure. We should be resisting it, and we should be seeking alternative methods. But at the same time, we also want to understand what options are available to us by entering into those dangerous zones. I think we have to make a new peace with the sense of the inhuman, right? That's part of looking at the overhuman or the ultra-human or whatever Nietzsche was looking at on the other side. You can't get there from the human without going through the inhuman. And some of the inhuman is going to be disastrous for us, but some of the inhuman is an invitation to a higher grade mutation.
Here's an apocalyptarian prompt. It feels like, there is a negative energization for the emergence of these architecture of peak experiences. In other words, you can't mandate this. If you do, then what you will cause is sort of the opposite effect, it feels. I guess that was exemplified very well by rock and roll. It was, it wasn't supposed to be like that. Therefore, it was like that. There's a negative energization. And when you speak about the inhuman, you're talking about the ultimate negative energization. It's where humanism is becoming totalizing. Therefore, the energy comes from the inhuman and from the confrontation with that. And there's this weird tension in here, also at the connection with the coming emergence of these peak experiences, right?
Well, this is where, if I'm going to jump on,
Please.
I've said to you before, Daniel, I quite like the notion of, say, an ontological theatre to put beside an ontological design. Because, I mean, and perhaps you disagree with this, but there's a notion to me within design of something being quite top-down planned. Like, if we're thinking of a totalitarian planner who wants to design subjectivity for the 21st century, design the AI systems, design the total immersive environments and so forth, that will create a particular kind of human that will do the sort of things that Layman's been nudging towards. But then there's also this, as I said, ontological theatre, which I think leaves a bit more room for playfulness and improvisation. And I'm interested in if we're talking on these terms, like designs of environments, designs of communities and conditions that allow for spontaneous, playful theatre that's gonna allow that Dionysian energy to emerge forth in strange ways. It's like a rock show, it's theatre, right? It's not designed in a sense, but you put on your costumes, you plug in the guitars and it goes, there's playing there, but it's playing with electricity, playing with dynamism, playing with sexuality in brilliant ways. And so that's
Well, one of the interesting things, if you guys read that Graeber and Wengrow history book that everybody was reading last year, The Dawn of Everything, not a perfect volume, but one of the things that's interesting about it is the way they look at early civilizations, early cities, right? Where a lot of people moved in and out of the settlements at different times of the year, right? So there was no way for a social system to be completely imposed because people only did it part of the year, and also you could just leave. And as a result, there was much more playfulness and imagination and plural social imaginaries that were available. That's the argument in the book. So I think we do need to have a much greater richness of social options available to us. Right? And what we've got now is a system that, while nominally allowing people to be very diverse in their uses of information, in their consumer items and things like that, it's actually creating a lot of narrowed homogeneity. So we've got to seek spaces in which multiple possibilities are being opened continually, right? It's got to be a lot of play. It's got to be a lot of liberty. And part of the liberty part is we have to be doing the rock and roll thing, which is pushing the boundary of what's acceptable in order to gain freedom for ourselves. We have to be gaining anti-fragility rather than adapting just to the system. We've got to push that. There was something else I was going to say, but it slips my mind.
I want to hear your thoughts on the strange paradox between options and constraint. We are Westerners, we are humanists, whether we like it or not. Maybe we are the most Western and humanists in the whole world, despite the what other people may say. So, but there's this weird thing, right? Between sometimes rock and roll needs constraints to emerge. Options, or that energy that comes from breaking rules, requires constraint first. And sometimes, conversely, options lead to constraint. Too much liberty leads to inadvertent constraints, too many constraints. And so there's a weird paradox here. So do we need a greater, more meta, more encompassing field of view with bigger theories and big, or do we need just perhaps a clear view of this feedback loop between options and constraint within the pieces that we already have at the board?
Well, I think we need a more ambidextrous form of thinking in general, right? It sounds like paradoxes, but really we should be assuming everything we're looking at in this community is always going to be like that, right? Do we need more passive or more active? Well, we need both, and in the appropriate proportionality that's circumstantially adaptive, right? Do we need more or less discipline? Depends who you are and where you are, but obviously you need both in some kind of mix. And if we lose any of these, we end up doing the thing that everybody in the systems we're critiquing is doing, which is they're taking a side, right? And it's not like we shouldn't take a stand, but we can't take a side in the options that they're using, right? So when we look at discipline and optionality, of course, we need to be good at both. We need to be better at both. And we've got to find the sweet spot between them where we maximize both of them in a way that's advantageous to us.
But what does it actually mean to be ambidextrous?
It means to be, to keep at least two asymmetrical competencies in play in all of your relationships and in all of your thinking, right? So there's lots of different ways to do that. It could be right and left hand. It could be two different perspectives or two different narratives. A lot of what I'm dealing with is spiritual practice or things that are like spiritual practice. And a lot of that's your mind and your heart, or your heart and your body, or your left and your right brain, or your conscious and your unconscious, or things like that. If you've got at least two systems in play trying to coordinate with each other, that's the minimum necessary in order to achieve some kind of hybridization. And if we're looking for something like peak experiences, if we're looking for something like emergent, creative, advanced coordination that goes beyond what we are right now, we've got to take our options and discipline ourselves to coordinate them to produce something that's more than the sum of the parts. Otherwise, we're stuck just at the level of the parts and acting like we have to decide between those parts.
And so just to text your ambidextrousness and I don't know, how do you say this word?
Ambidextrosity.
Whatever. Just says how much
Perfect.
you can write with both hands. Can you conceive of a scenario where to be ambidextrous requires very, very, very ugly things?
Sure, it often has in the past. It would be nice if in the future it wouldn't be as horrible as it was in the past. But most of the things that got done in human history involved very, very horrible things. And the people who got them done were often the people who were more ambidextrous, right? Like a Julius Caesar character was a guy who was able to bring a lot of elements together and cause them to interact in ways that were productive. And often there's, like, here's a good example, is the question, it pertains a little bit to the war thing. Like, what's the relationship between nations and states? You know, in a way, it's a bit of a Dugan question, right? Like, is the nation confined to the state, or are people outside your borders who have the same cultural background and language as you actually part of your nation, right? Or you look at something like the United States, and it looks like there's at least two nations constantly arguing over who gets to control the state, and as a result, they don't make much progress. So do we break down states to match nations? Should Quebec and Scotland and the Kurds all have homelands? Or do we try to adapt people who live within a state to be a nationality, right? So both of those are potentially violent options, because states will resist being modified to accommodate the actual dimensions of nationalities. But if you wanted to cultivate a nationality that fit the state that you live in, historically, that's involved a long time and a lot of violence. Right? The Spanish didn't just become the Spanish very quickly and in a nice way. It was war and brutality. There were caste systems and tortures and torments and battles. We really need to find ways to do that faster and easier and with less collateral damage. But our historical examples are such that we've mostly seen it involve some very horrific things. And undoubtedly, it will involve some awful things going forward. We can hopefully minimize that, but we can't make it go away.
Because to be a little bit Zizekian, he's new technologies, new year, new problems. So it is almost as if you are displacing violence from the site of the physical body onto capital, and then competition within capital, and then sort of the war machine implicitly, and then in turn towards the informational sphere. And it is precisely by tracking the motion of that violence that we also track the forming of perhaps new communities. You mentioned that America is in a war between two nations within a state. Well, those two nations are also, there are historical reasons for their division between themselves as nations, but a lot of those reasons are today very informational. The site of violence is informational, therefore the creation of communities is informational. This is very Girardian to say, right? people bond over, shared witnessing of a murder, of bloodshed, and then create rules based on that trauma.
It's very Girardian and it's very Mcluhanesque, right? That our traditional way to bond together is to inflict violence on an innocent person who we believe to be guilty. And McLuhan was saying, like, look, as soon as you have technology where you get instant information, you're delocalized. You're not sure where you are and you don't have borders. And because you don't have borders, you don't have an identity. And in order to get an identity, you got to push up against somebody else and see if you can feel your own edge. And so that's what we're seeing a lot of, is people picking fights on purpose to start to feel like they are somebody again.
And so hypothetically, if you were a consultant trying to design, not design things, but perhaps people, then what you would be worried about, instead of, designing the media and the information that I actually look at, would potentially be the tactical purveyance of conflicts. Like, this is a very very shitty example, but we know that there were Russian bots like putting Antifa against Trump people, scheduling protests for the same place to create that so that they could frame the debate. You frame the conflict, you frame the debate. And I feel like it is as if statecraft today requires this level of thinking. Create a conflict so that you could steer the sort of hearts of the people. And in this case, that conflict is not only physical, but also very informational.
I think that's true. I think the system we're in does that automatically, and the people who are running the system are starting to adapt to thinking that way. And we have to be very careful, because if you go around, say, integral or spiral dynamics community, the obvious thing is they're going to be like, hey, we're in the West and we're modern and postmodern, and that's made us a little bit weak, and we're not ready for these blue amber traditionalists to attack us. There's some truth to that, but we have to be much more critical. We have to be much more kind of quasi-Marxist in looking at this and going, hey, this system is built to stabilize itself. Zizek is good at saying just how adaptive and self-stabilizing and metastable capitalism and modernism in general are. And the way it stabilizes is it always gives you two sides, and both of those sides are its side. Right. So we need to be ambidextrous in part because the system is ambidextrous. If you were the Illuminati and you wanted to run the world, you would always have a narrative and an anti-narrative. You'd always have two sides and let them fight. And I think I said this maybe when I was talking to Brendan, but oh no, it was on my Stoa presentation, right? It's not, the system isn't selling you a story that you can rebel against. The system is a boxing promoter who gets paid when the fight happens.
Yes. Yes, beautiful. And that's the beauty of Guy Debord, like the spectacle wins. That's why the metaphor of the promoter is so sexy. Like, it is the spectacle that recuperates in every single thing that takes place in its midst. And why is there a spectacle? I would say that it's not because there's an Illuminati running the game. It's not because there's these Rothschilds running the game, but rather because there is momentum, and because there's a certain level of, there's something barred to us, and it is as if we were forced to engage in that game, moving forward with that game. I'm just making this very long stretch to connect to the barred subject and to the barred absolute. There are things that we cannot do. We cannot escape capitalism. We have to be in its midst. Outside of capitalism is barred to us, and therefore there's a level of like directionality that we are prompted towards.
It's an interesting thing when you look at nature, because nature is full of camouflage and deception, right? Animals grow a fake eye or something on their body, and the idea is that a predator will attack that thinking it's the vulnerability, and they'll still be safe, right? And it doesn't take a lot of intelligence or complexity to have a fake vulnerability. It's very common in nature. Capitalism is also like that, right? It presents you with what's probably the problem. It's the truckers, it's the anti-vaxxers, it's the Republicans, it's the Democrats, it's whatever. There's an obvious enemy. If we could just get everybody in school better or whatever it is, there's a vulnerability, and we attack the vulnerability and nothing changes because that was not the vulnerability. The vulnerability is more mysterious, right? You have to encounter some kind of internal thwart or paradox, that represents the barred subject's actual existence within that system in order to start to find a way out. You can't find a way out by looking for the target that the thing itself has presented to you as the problem.
And the vulnerability doesn't exist, but its non-existence exists everywhere. And it defines everything. It articulates every single interaction. So it is not that we are chasing the wrong thing. It is that the fact that chasing needs to be oriented around the virtual object of desire that doesn't exist, but it's the desiring, it's the motion. It's like a tunnel vision, but there's no end to the tunnel. The end of the tunnel does not exist. Yet it is precisely the North Star, the absent God of history, of the world. It's the invisible hand. The absent meaning of life in the cosmos. Like, where is that meaning? We don't know. Therefore, we chase it. Therefore, civilization.
Yeah, when you look at like spiritual history and practice, which is a community I'm in a lot, there are some advantages to your nervous system and your immune system and your coordination to deal with ascending aspirational polarization, right? You can do some good things for yourself that way, but it's not sufficient, right? In order to, there's a whole other system. There's a descending system. There's something you're going to miss as long as you're moving toward the positive, right? You have to instead stop and try to deal with the thing you were trying to escape, try to find the thing that appears to be located in its own absence, right? And that's where the possibility of escape from the structural set of dualistic sides that recreate the same system.
You say more about that. So you've got like your practice aiming towards some kind of God or transcendent or heavenly. Is that what the first thing you're nodding towards is?
Yeah, very much so.
And
so
then the second is more to do with internal absence or systemic absence. Am I understanding you correctly?
Well, in the first case, you would deal with the insufficiency of your ability to access the divine. Right? In a way, this is kind of a classic non-dualistic perspective, right? You go, well, where is transcendence located? It can't be located apart from where I am. And so some people make the obvious jump from there and go, well, you shouldn't do any seeking or striving or changing because it's already always completely present. But if it's already always completely present, then it's present in the form of your trying to find it and failing to some degree. Yeah. Right? The Christian metaphor of we roll away the stone and looked in the cave and God wasn't in there. The body had vanished. Right? And that's the opening to this, Christian eon. You don't find it when you look for it. And that's exactly, you haven't made a mistake. That's where you should be looking for it, is where you didn't find it. And when we look at the social sphere of possibilities, we should be looking for those things that don't work and for those intractable antagonisms and contradictions, and not assuming they need to be quickly resolved. And the normal resolution idea is we have to get rid of the other side, right? We have to get rid of those misinformed people, those people that are on the wrong side. Now, there's a more advanced way to do the same thing, which is we have to get rid of that structural antagonism by balancing them out in a very integrated, nice way, right? Just put them all together in one set and everything's great. But the only thing left out by naive integralism is in fact the antagonistic contradiction between the different perspectives and worldviews, which is precisely the thing we should be willing to look at and feel more deeply in order to find out where the actual integrative possibilities are.
Wow. You just blew me away right there when you said all of that stuff, but especially like you don't find it where you look for it, but that's the right way. And yet it not being there, yet it moves.
When you look at, if you read the discourses of the classic Zen masters, right, it's really ambiguous what they're saying about enlightenment, right? Because enlightenment and non-enlightenment become very ambiguous terms. And one of the things they're often pointing people toward is where you feel the thwart in your own understanding, where you feel the paradox, where you find the absence of the Buddha mind, that's precisely where it's located. You're maybe not valuing it properly, you're not experiencing it deeply enough, but that's where you should be looking for it. You shouldn't be looking for it as an alternative to the thing you're trying to escape. You should be looking at it in the intensity of the thing you're trying to escape.
In
Wow.
the intensity, because intensity is process. That's very, that almost sounds Deleuzian, and that made me tingle, because I work a lot with intensity, like in myself. It's not about like the thing in itself, but it's how hard you seek it and how it makes you feel, and sort of how you establish yourself in a relationship of desire with it. And are you triggering the right emotion within yourself? How intensely?
Yeah. No, and there's classic, I mean, we tend to be homeostatic. We're looking for a certain kind of balance, right? Which means we reject intensities. And as a result, we very often don't find the gateway to new kinds of homeostasis. And one of the major ways that shows up in the kind of world we're talking about is cognitive dissonance, right? Different parts of yourself, different drives, different perspectives, different worldviews, they're fighting each other. And we want to either solve it, pick a side, or fuse them. But all of that refuses the sensation of the cognitive dissonance, right? And if we want to be liminal, if we want to dwell in this time between worlds, we have to be better at occupying that frustrating intensity between the perspectives, in the parallax of the overlap that we normally reject. If we can inhabit that better, that's when it starts to grow into cognitive resonance rather than cognitive dissonance. But you got to try to stay there.
But that's also why rock and roll is precisely about that, throwing oneself into chaos and that ontological imbalance. Fuck homeostasis. Like, that's what rock and roll says ultimately. That's, you know, Rem Koolhaas, the architect, he's very rock and roll, and what he says is fuck context. I'm gonna build a huge, like, decontextualized like UFO, as if a UFO had just landed. This is my building now. Fuck context. And there's a level of that in rock and roll, in Pagli, and this energy that we're talking about.
You got to have an attitude that enables you to do that, right? And it's not like you can't turn your back totally on homeostasis. You just fall apart completely. But you've got to be able to bring in some more chaos to challenge it forward to become a better homeostasis. And in order to do that, you need some emotional and attitudinal force, right? You've got to be able to say to yourself, all right, fuck that. I'm going to try the chaos. I'm going to see how much of it I can integrate.
Because our embeddedness within the cycle of chaos and order, to be Petersonian, or like options and constraint, is unavoidable. And that's what I was sort of mentioning a while ago. Like, it's not like, you know, we speak on the side of rock and roll, and then we speak on the side of let's invent a new structure. Cool. We do this forever. Can we ever not do this? No. What is barred from us than not doing that? The inaccessible other thing that is not the non-being engaged in this, right? Whose inaccessibility is precisely everywhere. And so it is as if we are treading, okay, Manuel de Landa, it is as if by being in the human engine, the human process, is this relationship between order and chaos, homeostasis, and then breaking that homeostasis. Cool. This creates a certain level of motion. Motion through what? Well, we don't really have that overwhelming perspective, which would imply homeostasis, that would allow us to understand exactly where we are going and where we came from. There's a barred infinite, there's a barred meaning, there's a barred subject, like there's things we cannot know, period. But however, it still moves, and its motion can be tracked through history. It is like the angel of history of Beauclerk that is flapping his wings away from Eden, and in its wake, all it leaves is the debris of history. History as debris, as byproduct. It's very interesting because it's precisely on that excess and byproduct that you can actually trace a shape, because it's not a random shape. It's going somewhere. Some things do exist, and they exist not in the way that we want when we are rock and roll and want to break things because we're just angry at mom. It's not in the way that when we want to build things and make them really proper because we're just really scared of mom. But actually, it's just the debris of that. It's just our pouring of intensity and excess into that perhaps causes this debris. And that debris is what we call history, is what we call the shape of conflict, the shape of the noosphere, the shape of the current wars. And it's precisely in like dwelling within that debris, not the conflict. The conflict is the engine, but the debris itself, like its shape, it tells me something. In a way similar to Manuel de Landa, it is as if that debris is the material itself that we are treading almost as if we were blacksmiths trying to understand what the steel is telling us, like we're crafting something that may one day be like a sword.
That's tremendously important, I think. You know, and in some ways it's what's physically real, right? If you dive into physics really deeply, you're never finding the thing itself. You're always finding some pattern of its effects.
Yeah.
And when we look at, you know, this kind of dichotomy that we might associate with game being metamodernism and dark Renaissance intellectual deep web polarizations in our community, you can see that one of them is tending to do a kind of top-down overview, even though they're saying a lot of things we agree with. The other side is really privileging the process that you have to go through. And the way they come together is at this place where you start to see the structure of the process, because that's simultaneously process and simultaneously a structural vision. And where do you find the structure of process? Is by dwelling in the wake, in the debris of the process itself.
Because the doing of the process itself betrays some shape. It gives us some clues. The process doesn't happen tabula rasa.
Yeah, it's not a matter of choosing between the left and the right brain, between representational mapping and immersive process. But the question is, how do we establish a better relationship between these two? Right. And it has to be, you have to find something that's a left brain-like version of how the right brain operates. And you've also got to somehow favor elements of the right brain that support the left brain. They've got to work as a better team somehow. They've got to both hold each other in check and get better at mapping each other. The left brain, or, you know, the overview people, need to have a much better picture of what the process dynamics actually are, so that these two sides can come closer together and we can actually get this engine moving.
I would say I agree with you. As a side comment, I would say it's perhaps even dirtier. It's not so much left brain and right brain, but psychosexual profiles and the histories of our personal shames and of our personal guilts and angers, and how they reflect themselves and how we speak. And that psychosexual angle, to me, feels more right. Because when you speak left brain, right brain, it has a tinge of science. It almost feels like an absolute, like a tabula rasa that is not there. But the real shape of things comes in the sex, comes in the dirt, comes like who you really are. And there's, but this is a side point. There is most certainly material, and that material is, what we are inadvertently threading, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, there's all kinds of different ways to language it, but the extruded obscene complement to whatever we're working on has to be the privileged side of our inquiry, right? And it's very nice. There's a sexuality series on the Integral Stage, right? And so a lot of it is, you know, very nice, well-meaning baby boomer neo-tantra, which is great. People should be getting better at that. But there's an element of the quality of perversion itself, which is necessary, right? It's not just about healthy sexuality. It's also about how you relate to the part that you don't feel is healthy sexuality, or that worries you, or that by your own definition is being marginalized or excluded.
And the worrying
that's part of the shape of what we are.
And the shape of the worrying itself sometimes.
Yeah.
Oftentimes. That's where it gets so granular that it becomes impossible once again. And by becoming precisely impossible, that's the challenge for a new attitude. I feel like I've exhausted my granularity in this thread.
How about you, Owen? What's going on?
I'm enjoying you and Motormouth Fraga talking. I think it's kind of interesting to think about the dynamics that show up between different people as well, right? Because it's funny. I'm just reflecting, in so many areas of my life, I am the loudmouth crazy one. And then when I collaborate with Daniel, I'm much more the guy who takes a back seat and lets him go, blah, 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 and I smile and giggle and make a sarcastic comment here and there and let him go. But I'm kind of, that's what I'm thinking right now.
Well, that's part of the definition of a good team. If you're playing soccer or something, somebody's got to be able to take the lead and fall back. And then the other time somebody else gets the ball, they've got to take the lead and you've got to fall back. So you've got a good partnership if you can play off each other that way. Sometimes be the loudmouth and sometimes be the enjoying witness of the other loudmouth.
It's a dance and it's a relationship. It's like someone is being the provocative feminine who's dancing around and flaring, and then somebody's just there like, okay, I see that going on.
Again, in this, I see this dialectical relationship between the human and the inhuman. Is it me being the loudmouth? Is it you not being loudmouth, or like being and being? Is it really us? Or rather, are the energies, and to an extent, independent in and of themselves? Is there a sort of new omahia happening where we are the vessels and the battleground and the spoils, where the battle between these energies, intelligences, things that animate? I am perfectly comfortable with assuming that it is the inhuman, the unconscious that is speaking when one gets excited and creates these beautiful spaces where we scaffold these conversations, comfortable, fun, smart, fucking beautiful people. But who is talking? It's not necessarily me or Owen or you. If the conversation is in any way somehow being genuine, then what we're actually witnessing is something inhuman, but inhuman in the most earnest, genuine, good sense, as the expression of something that wasn't expressed hitherto, unbounded by the scaffolds of previous structures. Do you have a view on that?
Yes, well, we're mouthpieces of the gods, right? There's a number of different ways to characterize that which speaks through us, right? It could be our memory. It could be language itself that's talking. It could be emergence that's taking hold of us. It could be masculinity and femininity. There's a lot of different ways to think about it. And all those ways are something like the pantheon of the deities that our ancestors advocated for. Right? We have to have a sense that we are not necessarily the agents. And it's especially important in these, philosophical communities, I think in spiritual practice, to understand just how much is going on in these pagan, elemental, and subconscious domains, right? One of the key things people don't seem to think through very clearly in developmental theory is that they assume their conscious, waking, verbal mind is the thing that's evolving through the stages, right? And there's ways you can critique stages themselves, but if you take them, you go, it's my subconscious that has to develop through stages. It's smarter than I am, and I would like it to get even smarter, even more spiritual. I would like to help it out, but I'm not the agent. I'm not the entity. I am at best a helper.
But when modernism, like in architecture, the transition between modernism and postmodernism was very marked by the World War, and how after the World War, people were like, oh, holy shit, all of our fascination with modernity, reason, concrete, steel, flat shapes, rationality, the perfect house, the machine for living, the optimal measured man, that when shit got real, it mattered nothing. And so after the war, people had to come up with, okay, well, postmodernism, like we need to like think about broader perspectives, but also think about integrating different bits of our thinking. So a little bit like giving some space at the table for the emptiness of the unconscious, for the unknown to sit in, for that agency that animates us to somehow have a vessel for expression, because otherwise it happens what you have just described, which I completely agree that I see in certain communities that we're in, which is it's a certain overvaluement of the rational mind. And here's the structure. Here's another structure on top of that. Oh, and there's a space where there's another structure. Holy shit. Where's the breathing in that? Where's the chaos in that? So it's also recurring. It's also like a vice of the mind.
It reminds me a little bit about what Owen was saying about creating spaces of play, right? Because one of the reasons you do that is because the existing set of options is clearly not succeeding, right? And when the postmodernists and the Dadaists and the surrealists looked at the war and they, hey, all that progress, all that reasonable management of the system led us to the worst tragedy that's ever occurred on this planet. There's got to be something else, right? And I think we're seeing that now in our communities, where 20 years ago, people were saying, hey, we're going to be reasonable. We're going to integrate the parts of our life. It'll be fantastic. I'll be the new integral human. And now we're looking around going, maybe we need magic. Maybe we need art. Maybe we need the unconscious. Maybe we need aliens. What we don't know. Everything has to be on the table now, because what we've been doing so far clearly isn't working. This bus is heading right for the cliff. And if there's any way out, it's not one of the things we've been doing so far. So we've got to open up a plurality of possibilities that we can inhabit, just to have a chance to find what might be an alternative to what we've been doing. And a huge part of that is getting smarter about the unconscious and thinking that we can help with it. Because I think the two mistakes we make that are reciprocal are, on the one hand, imagining that my conscious waking mind is the agency and the intelligence. And the other reciprocal mistake is imagining that the unconscious just is and is fixed and perfect, right? Whereas we should be thinking, how can these work together to make both of them smarter? I think one of the things we see in some really interesting spiritual technologies is the idea that you could help your unconscious intelligence get wiser, get smarter, get a better instinct, right? We've evolved a lot of unconscious capacities that are very well adapted to the kinds of circumstances human beings have lived in for hundreds of thousands of years. But are they good intuitive guides to the kind of world that we're running into that we've never encountered? And so if not, how do we get our unconscious smart enough to intuitively take over the world we're seeing? How do we make a smarter, stronger, more powerful unconscious? That's a really important question. Sorry, I cut you off, Owen. What were you going to say?
Well, I actually wanted to ask an aside question, which is kind of for my own filling in my knowledge, which is, what is the influence, say, of integral philosophy in terms of like sociologically? Because I noticed you saying, so this is like 20 years ago, people were thinking we need to integrate these different parts. And I mean, I'm 26, right? I've been around in this scene for a couple of years, found rebel wisdom, ended up hanging out with Alexander Bard and blah, blah, blah. But I don't really know the history, or whether this is just a little spiritual niche, or whether there's actually people in high places who have ever heard any of these ideas or what. So as an aside, can you give us a little sociological gram?
Well, I think it's much more sociologically potent now than it was, but there was a moment, like the golden moment of Ken Wilber's version of integrative philosophy, right? There was a moment around 2000 where he had all these books, where the president of the United States was carrying around one of his books. Bill Clinton was, all these celebrities were talking about it. And there was this sense that it was going to be this great big thing. But of course, that was naive. It was premature. It was the system that had been set up wasn't competent to actualize the ideas. It needs to be much messier. It needs to be much more complicated. It needs to merge and find relationships with all these other communities that were already doing similar things. I think he was, because of his output and his sort of public status at a certain moment of history, he was a really good way for a lot of people to find each other. So that kind of community emerged, which is probably the most important part of what happened there. And then he also sort of, in hindsight, I think he set the bar to beat, is how I say it. If you want to have a big picture model, it's got to be at least as good as his. But there was this moment where everybody was very positive. We were going to get integrative conscious capitalism. Oh, everything was going to be fantastic. Integral Judaism, integral Christianity. It was a real positive. That was before my involvement. I was aware of it peripherally. I didn't get involved till a little bit later. But clearly it was premature, overly optimistic, narrow, and fragile. And it received some knocks. It got knocked down. It dissipated a little bit to the point where people went, did the project fail? Is there anything to it? You know, and that kind of critique, I think, is also premature. Like, how long did it take for Christianity to get started? You know, centuries. We won't really know for a long time what kind of effect this could have. But I think we do know that there are a lot of similar communities and similar thinkers. And in this overlapping space between people who are recognizing similar sets of insights, there's a potential for a diverse, powerful cultural movement, you know, of the quasi-integral. That's probably where the real energy is going forward. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's quite helpful. So I mean, that's interesting that Bill Clinton was carrying a book, so there was some elite American catch on at some point.
Yeah, it was trendy. It had a trendy moment.
Okay,
for sure.
Like I've been thinking recently, I feel like one of the things I want to be part of is to create a new 1960s. To get that degree of Dionysian artistic expression and blast it out into culture again. And I don't know exactly what the fuck that's going to look like.
No, there's an interesting question there, which is, can you create a 1960s without a 1950s? Right? Like, is the 1960s an alternative to the 50s, or did the 50s continue to develop and then unfold into the 60s?
So I guess that's
the
question. Yeah, there's many layers to think about it, right? There's the economic layer. There's the just like absolute security and solidarity of the 50s enabling an explosion in the 60s. Is there something else at the level of historical archetypes? In the same way, it's, what am I trying to say here? I'm really feeling my way in the dark. There's some kind of, the 60s goes into a spiritual and aesthetic space that was uncomfortable for straight culture, you might say. It was like, whatever the symbols, whatever the forms of dress, the forms of presenting that have been popular for the last few decades, no, we're going to do something new, perhaps very influenced by romanticism. I'm wondering, I guess, because earlier you were saying about this, the difficulty of getting beyond the like pseudo oppositions of capitalism. That itself is a kind of straight culture. And something totally other, perhaps this inhumanness, which is what burst forth in the 60s, is kind of what I'm sniffing after today.
It's a really interesting question, because there's a challenge to straight culture that the 60s presented that was very powerful and rewarding and opened up a lot of energy. And I think that's necessary again, because there's a lot of conservative caution in the cultural information space now. A lot of people are worried about expressing themselves offensively. The people who used to be the liberals are sort of the most shut down now. And right, it's all well and good to go to your shamanically guided ayahuasca session, but nobody's doing the free range LSD experiments of Hunter S. Thompson anymore. So something has to break free of this caution layer that's in place. But there's two concerns I have with that. They don't negate it, but they're additional concerns. One is, we actually need something better than the 60s, because the 60s were the baby boomers, right? That's where Joe Biden comes from, is the 1960s. And they lived through all that, but they didn't really change. They became people who just nostalgically validated themselves for having done a little bit of cultural experimentation and reinforced everything that's wrong about game A. So it's got to be a 60s that's even better than the 60s. And then the question of how it fits together with the 50s is intriguing to me, because in some ways it's a refutation of the 50s. And in other ways, it's the growing up of the children who are raised in the atmosphere of the 1950s, not just rebelling, but also continuing, right? Continuing the optimism, continuing the sense of experimentation. America after the war felt so confident, and the West did in general, and had mixed its population. It asked people to do things during the war they'd never done. It asked races to mix. It sent the women to work. It took people out of their jobs and put them in new jobs. The amount of upheaval and churning and turnover and remixing in society was very powerful. And as a result, people were more experienced. They felt triumphant. They had this sense that, hey, maybe we can upload all our new technology and start using it. Like, let's implement that color TV stuff. Let's implement those drugs. Let's actually go to the moon. We've got the rockets. There was a sense of, hey, we can try stuff. And I think that did exist in the post-war 1950s era. And the kids who came up through that assimilated some of that confidence, like, fuck it, we can just do this. And you need that to have a 60s, but you got to get that somewhere first. People need that confidence.
But maybe that's also part of what went wrong, is that, well, they had the confidence, but they also had the slightly naive sense that they were the good people. And so it turns into this almost like egotistic spiritual bypassing. It's like, we did our acid in the 60s, so now we can run capitalism, and that's fine. And maybe that's what
their sense of being the good people. I think it's appropriate to target that in a number of different ways, right? If you watch, I mean, it's very inspiring to look at old footage of a bunch of kids in white sitting in front of Ram Dass, and they're all smiling and feeling their spirituality for the first time. It's very beautiful. Something is opening there. But when you look at it with a little bit of suspicion, you think, maybe their vitality is being drained in this moment. Maybe demons are eating them, right? And they're just experiencing it as positivity. If only we could let go of all that negative old culture and just open ourselves and just be positive, just focus on goodness and peace and love. Well, it turned out that didn't work very well. They were missing a whole chunk of what it takes in order to ground that in reality in human life. So we need to be very suspicious of all of the very optimistic, very positivistic movements. Not that there isn't real progress possible, but if you don't focus more on the darkness, you're going to sabotage all the benevolent.
I think that's precisely what's present in the notion of an idea like a dark renaissance. It's like saying, let's have an artistic cultural renaissance, but let's not be naively self-indulgent in our sense of self. It's like, if this is going to work, it has to really go deeper and darker than things have before. And then in so doing so, permit itself to have the confidence and the courage to go forward and experiment with new forms.
That's absolutely right. And that's why I think we're hearing that cry come out in our communities lately, right? And whether it's dark renaissance or hell of metamodernism or whatever it is, people are saying, look, we got to be careful here with that approach, because if we try to naively adapt to our generate new systems approach, we're going to end up smuggling in all the same subliminal structures that sabotaged it every time in the past and caused it merely to replicate the existing system. And the only way out of that is to undo or reverse some of the evaluations with which we're going in. Right? We've got to start reaching for that dark side and the shape that that dark side presents, so that when we try to implement a game B, when we try to build a postmodernism, it doesn't have the contamination of game A already built into it. And if we don't do it the right way, we're going to get a complete failure of everything we're being promised.
Here's where I want to add something to what you said, maybe in contradiction. I don't think it's about the configuration of options versus constraint. It's not about the specifics of how that configuration looks like, how much of X and how much of Y you have. The world is only demons. And the 60s was an intensity of triumphalism over the old ones. So the only thing that we're noticing right now that we're facing is just, let's be intense. That's the only recipe. The recipe cannot be one of, let's really thoroughly investigate the old ones and try to make sure that the new ones, that we're very careful with them. No. Intensity or nothing, because coming back to the beginning, that's the only thing that we have access to, and non-intensity is kind of barred to us. So we have to deliver ourselves to this ontological imbalance, to this risk of intensity, and perhaps forfeit a little bit the illusion of security that a thorough analysis of the previous conditions would give us. Now, not to say to be careful, careless or gratuitous. We need to study the environment and we need to be craftspeople. We are not foolish, but my onus is always on intensity. That's my feeling. And like a couple of notes that I took when you guys were talking is the 60s were an intensity of triumphalism, of new demons over the old ones. And if we can do anything right now, is to invent new demons, better demons, our demons, intense demons. We're not going to invent angels.
Yeah, there's a sort of difference in the discourse, right? If you're doing the objective description discourse and you're like, well, we don't mean just intensity. We mean a certain range of intensity accommodated in a certain way. You're like, yes, but when we're doing the process discourse, we're saying you've got to take the risk that intensity represents. And there's some degree that you're never going to know, right? It's always going to be a risk. Maybe it's going to be too intense. If you're not willing to take that risk, then you're not really going to engage with the intensity. I think all of that's true, and those discourses work well together if we can get it through our heads that they can work together. But the other thing I'd add is, and I lean into this a lot, right? The shamanic skill sets are necessary now, right? If all we're dealing with are echelons of demons, then we have to get better at working with demons, right? You got to get better at forging alliances, at discerning between demons, at taming demons, at all those old sorceress shamanic skills have got to come back in a real way, and in a way that's not just about what happens in the forest with psychedelics, but in a way that happens with technology, with culture, with everything we're facing in the information space. This is a shamanic arena now, and we have to become better at doing the shamanic skills.
Phenomenal. And I love that. This one time I had a chat with Paul Robson. He's a Orthodox Christian, and we found ourselves agreeing with the fact that there's a spiritual war happening right now. Now, this may seem odd, weird, strange, but the fact is, when we speak about shamanism, when we speak about the spiritual war of angels and demons, even when Alexander Dugin fucking creates a geopolitical theory that allows him and his paymaster to invade a country, we are literally just talking about a discipline, a craft, transistor theory. It's nothing but the design of the pathways through which ideas come to be in the world. To call them demons is perhaps to inflate them a little bit and make them look big and scary, sure. But to add to what you said, shamanism, in my view, is precisely just what we are doing right here, right now. The invocation of ideas, their flow between people, the creation of an environment where people are sort of receptive and it works to it, everybody's in good faith and all that. And I feel like that's, process discourse. You mentioned something about process discourse. I really like that. And I would say that the techne of shamanism should really be demystified and brought into the range of the right here, right now, of the symbolic order and of the tension between things. Because when you're like having a discussion with a guy on the street that just cut you off with the traffic, isn't that shamanism? That's shamanism par excellence. Because the energy between you being angry at the guy cutting you off is so alive, so processual, so many demons right there, right? So there's a level of
just, there's shamanism, and there's also this always stands out to me. The dimension of the occult has been undervalued in our communities, right? I do a lot of conversations with John Vervaeke about the religion that isn't a religion and things like that. And what always stands out to me is, why aren't we talking about the magical societies? They've been trying to do this very thing all along, right? And they've been trying to deal with it, right? We do the Aleister Crowley thing, and like, look, everything in your life is magic. Right? It's about how you navigate with forces, with entities, with the entity-like versions of idea spaces and realities and energies. So there's basic practical skill sets, and there's also experimental social organizations that have been trying to do the very things that we're looking at now from the point of view of integrative philosophy or new cognitive science. I go, well, how could we possibly do that? Well, we can't ignore the fact that people have been trying to do this in the past. And one of the reasons we haven't looked at it is because we've tended to marginalize them. They're associated with darkness. They're associated with the weird. They're associated with some marginalized aspect of reality. We've got to fold that in and bring them in as our brethren, because we have to do something like that going forward.
But the only people who shun them away to the margins are those who are not Western and creative enough. And by this, I want to say that, the Dugans of this world say that, no, there are different gods ruling each civilization. Nick Land, Crowley said everything is magic. Totally agree. Nick Land was the guy who went to the edge so hard that he went mad. And so when we speak about occultism, my interpretation is to go as close as you can towards the inaccessibility of God, to rolling out the stone and finding out that the body isn't there, but literally staying there and feeling that tension. If there's a tension between you and the guy that cuts you off on the road, then there's going to be a lot of tension between you and that realization that, holy shit, I just rolled the rock and Christ, the crucified, is not here. That tension and staying with it, it is precisely the motor engine of magic. And in many ways, it feels like it's reserved for those who are temperamentally inclined to something like this, right? You need to, the people who go into magic, they're a little bit crazy. There's a temperament to them. There's a certain
they have to be fluid, and they have to have some courage, and they have to be conversant with their own unconscious, things like that. And that's going to seem a little bit unstable and crazy to some of the more mainstream society.
It's interesting, like this gets towards the point that I ended my talk on Paglia with yesterday, that is something I just play around in my thinking, but I throw it out and let's see what you guys think of it. It's this, where it begins from the idea that if you look at the myth cycles, there's so much overlap between Christ and Dionysus. They're gods who are late to the party. They're gods associated with wine. They ride into the town on a donkey. Dionysus is pulled to pieces, but is resurrected a few days later. Christ crucified is resurrected a few days later. They're also both gods associated with loving everybody. Everybody comes together in Dionysus. Everybody comes together in Christ. They overturn the Apollonian hierarchies of the ancient pagan world. And yet there's something with certainly the rise and the institutionalization of Christianity, that all of the ecstatic or the transgressive elements of Dionysus seem to be pushed away. And what ends up being left with is this acceptance and love of the sinner in Jesus, but then this figure of the devil who represents desire and temptation. So it's almost like that Apollo Dionysus thing gets turned into Christ, God, and the devil. And the devil is evilness rather than just intensity. And this kind of seems to me to be the stake of what we're playing with. And it's not like a surprise that the Western occult has often played with symbols of the devil, of the diabolic, that heavy metal goes straight to the horns and to the devil. And it's not to be evil per se, but because that is precisely the face that the Dionysian energies have had to take.
Well, there's also, I mean, one of the first interesting things we did on the integral stage when we got it started was convene a session on integral Satanism, right? Because there's been a lot of talk about integral Christianity and integral Judaism. So we're like, okay, there can be integral anything then. And we got together some people from the Church of Satan who were conversant with developmental theory and had a discussion. And what came out of that discussion was, different models of what Satan means, right? And there's some sort of nihilistic, self-destructive abhorrence. You're like, well, we don't mean that one. We mean, in a developmental sense, the fact that a new value system, a better value system, a new God has to oppose the current value system. If you're going to go up a ladder, you've got to push down on rungs that previously seemed to be higher, the Nietzschean move of the transvaluation of values. You're going to try to explore terrain that's the opposite of your current value system, which means it's going to be stuff you currently find to be anti-valuable, right? So that the Satan not only stands for the missing subconscious complement of Christ, it also stands for the future integrated version of a higher value system that we're currently excluding. And we can't get to that next one unless you take your current highest values and lower them somehow. And the thing that suggests you do that is going to seem like it's the enemy of your best values. But that's where the potential access route is to a newer, better value system. That's the integral Satanism argument. But I think there's a lot to be said there, because the institutional bureaucratic structure of the church does something very similar to what the institutional bureaucratic structure of mainstream media, contemporary liberal centrist government is doing. It generates two oppositional dynamics so that it can maintain control. And instead of giving you the one combined dynamic that would be transformational, it asks you to take a side in a war between two opposing narratives. And in that move, it controls you through its ambidextrous meta-narrative.
Phenomenal. And this integral Satanism just is in that sense not that distinguishable from Christianity or any other thing, in that it puts in the throne of its memeplex not the good, not the bad, but the defeat of the bad versus the good, or the defeat of the good versus the bad. It's like the God of Christianity is a dead God. It is the dying that we venerate as Christians. And there's a remarkable intelligence to that, both in Christianity and re-emerging again in that integral Satanism, isn't there? It's the veneration of that act of dying, of that act of defeat, of the fall, of that negativity, of that inaccessibility. Once again, we circle around the same barred gate, the same locked gate. And there's poetry to this. There's a certain beauty to it.
There's a deep Christian possibility, right? There's a Nietzschean Christianity that's possible. It's not the only way to do it. You can do it out of any tradition or out of no tradition, but there is a Christian version of this, where the thing that Dionysus does, which is to die, to go down, all the things that Zarathustra calls us to in the prologue, right? Fall down, descend, return. There's so much of that in Christianity, that the God is dead, the God is missing, the God is broken. Drop all your things, fall down, be flipped over, be crucified. There's a beauty to that initiates the underlying wisdom of the world that we inhabit right now. It gives us the possibility of a superior Westernism, like you've been saying, right? But it has to be separated from all of the implicit nihilistic idealism within conventional Christianity that Nietzsche was critiquing. Right? We've got to be able to tease these things apart. And I think that's one of the major things in our communities, is to understand that everything we look at can go in either of the directions, right? It can be regressive and degenerative, or it can be progressive and deep and transformational and embrace the lack and turn it around. And whether we're going, hey, is Marxism good or not? Is capitalism good or not? Is Christianity good or not? Those are dumb questions, because we need to say, like,
but
what
Layman,
would be one that fits?
But Layman, isn't that's not meta enough, is it? Because if to be truly lost means that you're unable to answer the question, is this the right path or the wrong path?
Sure.
So
exactly, and this is what I was saying about overview discourse and process discourse, right?
Okay, tell me that.
I can sit back and go compare paths. That's the overview discourse.
Okay.
When you're in the process discourse, you're in the process. You're not in a position to have a look at it because you're going through it.
But then, is there any overview possible other than utter nihilism? Like, who am I to tell you that you're right or wrong?
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason there can't be superior relativisms, right? And that's the integral proposal.
But then we get into the master slave, and I'm okay with going into that. I'm a Machiavellian. I'll go harder than Owen knows me.
Okay.
But my point is, like, can we? Is that something that you're comfortable with? With the fact that there's a superior relativism, and that within the overview we can compare different processes, and that while within the process, because it feels like a safe valve. Am I wrong?
It's hard to know. You never know whether you're being too safe.
Exactly.
Right?
That's
you find
the point.
something that you think works for you.
Okay.
But it's never complete, right? So even if you go, hey, we've got the nice part about saying there's a superior relativism is you get to have both the superiority and the incompleteness. Right? And I think we're looking for something that affords us both of those. If you only had the incompleteness and no sense that we can take superior action, you wouldn't have the spiritual motivation to do anything in the world. But if you only had the superiority and you never accepted the fact that there are contexts which might undermine your context, then your action risks becoming totalitarian. So there's some kind of balance between those two. That's no matter how we do it, you need to somehow afford yourself greater capacity, clarity, and motivation to action, which involves a sense of superiority, without which you don't have peaks. But you can't do that in a way that attempts to naively totalize and absolutize reality as if you understand it all. So it's got to be some negotiation there. And it's not necessarily 50-50, it could be 80-20 or 90-10, but there's some kind of balance between both of those things that we need.
I agree. I agree. Wholly, because for one to dare get lost means that one is safe, or rather confident enough in the frame of the one that can in turn get lost. And for the one that is able to throw itself into defeat and being lost is the only one that can afford being found in turn, and that has to have a certain strength to begin with, a certain sense of superiority. May be foolish, but there's a something in there, I feel, that you are at the overview level, not the process level, that you're absolutely correct, because pure process level is schizophrenia.
They've got to work together. And that's, like I was saying, it's not necessarily 50-50, but they do have to somehow work together. Okay. I love this metaphor of getting lost, because one of the questions that's been with me my whole life is, how do we inhabit? And right now I'm thinking, how do we inhabit the time between worlds? How do we inhabit the meta crisis? How do we inhabit the apocalypse? Things like that. But it's an extension of a general question about what does it mean to become indigenous in something. And one of the ways you do that is you get lost and find your way out, if you find your way out, right? And when I was a kid, if we moved, that was always my strategy. I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to get completely lost in the new place. And if I find my way back, then I'm going to have an instinct about the landscape. Rather than knowledge, rather than a map, I'm going to have an instinct and a confidence. And that's part of me becoming an entity for a particular niche. And that could be an information niche, a technological niche, a cultural niche. But we've got to get better at
yourself. That. Yes. A perceptional niche, which is yourself.
Yeah.
Putting yourself through these intensities, which will frame the surrounding cognitive meplex, whatever.
No, and we've leaned too heavily into knowledge and awareness, right? There's how many people have been trying to raise consciousness for the past 100 years? How many people have been trying to get the message out that there's an environmental crisis? We know the problem is not insufficient awareness. It's not insufficient knowledge. It's that we don't know how to actually embody this reality. We don't know how to be an inhabitant. We know how to be aware, but we don't know how to inhabit. And that involves a lot of unconscious skill building, which involves taking that risk of intensity, that risk of being lost, that risk of facing the thwart and the incommensurability and the excluded qualities.
Wow. I love that. I love that derive that you throw yourself into. Guy Debord, like, as this, critical drunk Marxist as he was, artist guy, brilliant. I love him. But he had this tendency to, one of his things was about la dérive, which is to go into London with a map of Paris, get lost, see what happens. There's a certain beauty to that. Irrecuperable. You know how capitalism just makes everything into a product, but get lost. There's an intensity there that is that is very much your own.
Yeah, it's very similar to what Deleuze and Guattari were saying about deterritorialization.
Yeah.
Right. You've got to make some move that's roughly analogous to the schizophrenic so that you can escape the constant recapture by the framing of the system. And that's going to look random. It's going to look surrealistic. It's going to look crazy. It's going to look risky.
Lost without getting truly lost, and then come back, or come back. Hopefully, to the extent that that any of us is able to come back.
You come back different. Someone else comes back.
But that, and perhaps deterritorialization or schizoanalysis is the alchemical dissolution. Is the rock and roll energy of fuck you, of breaking systems as opposed to really fucking relying on them as if you were scared. And that is perhaps the more refined, sophisticated way to frame a lot of a little bit of the intention and the ethos behind what we do at Techno Social, which is that acid and that dissolution. Psychedelics do this, you know this, right? But there's a certain beauty to trying to do that consistently. What is gambling? What is throwing the dice? What is divination, if not a gamble with the inaccessible, with the God that isn't there, with the literal, the absolute unknown, but just having a conversation with that which isn't there. And via this conversation, via getting lost in that conversation, precisely within the searching of the throwing of the dice, there can be new ideas. There can be even methodically new ideas. If I were to answer the question, what's the new religion that doesn't look like a religion? Well, it has to look like gambling. It has to look like, because gambling is like a safe container. We want safe containers. But it has to be like at the center of it, it is pure luck.
And I think that's being supported now by a lot of what, science used to seem very controlled, very mechanical. And we've undergone a period of time now where it involves chaos, it involves complexity. And especially for me, what's important is it involves the sheer scale of nonlinear computation, right?
Mm-hmm.
That those unpredictable digits of pi that go forever and we can't predict them. A guy like Stephen Wolfram in computational science would say, look, most of the possible patterns in existence are like that. Only a very small number of patterns are reducible to something predictable. So how do you exist in a universe where science and technology is looking at that universe and saying, hey, almost all of it is unpredictable, irreducible patterning. So it's going to be as if random, right? Even if you could say it's actually secretly deterministic and a supercomputer could run it, that doesn't matter. When you encounter it, it's as if chance, it's as if random, it's as if unpredictable. So your basic existential relationship to that has to be something like a gamble, right? Badiou talks about this when he talks about the event, right? You want to become a subject or more of a subject, you're going to retroactively gamble that the event occurred, that something disrupted the encyclopedia of the world. You can't prove it, it's a gamble. But making that gamble is what's required in order to show up as more of a subject.
Every perception is a gamble. And when the randomness of the universe is passed through the filter of the perceivable, which is this other filter in addition to the scientific and to the possible, which are other filters that you mentioned. The perceivable meaning us, our eyes, our archetypes. Like I have 5 fingers. There's limits. So when the random is passed through this filter of the perceivable, and once we kind of like reify this filter of the perceivable in a tenable way, an identity that sustains itself through a few decades, or like a little institution that works for some time. And if you are able to do this transistor theory, this transistor thing properly, then you have power. So mechanisms of interpretation. Robert Anton Wilson said that every moment our senses capture billions and billions of data points, and out of those we select a little few and we call that our perception, our identity, our reality tunnels. It's precisely the act of the transitioning between the randomness and the actual that power consists of.
And you need to be emotionally capable of encountering that. And that's where the difficulty is. I met Robert Anton Wilson when I was a kid. He was my hero. I got to talk to him just a little bit before he died. And I remember him saying, it was in one of his books too, but he said, the only way you know you're getting any smarter is by realizing what an idiot you've been until just now.
Jesus
and
Christ.
when I think about that, I think, right, it's the emotional reluctance to encounter how stupid you've been that holds you back from getting smarter. And that's only a subset of the emotional reluctance of all humility, of all failure. We don't want to go into that place, but that's the place that enables our growth.
Robert Anton Wilson had neurological balls of steel, in the sense that, he would throw himself into such, his whole philosophy is about this, throwing oneself, lose yourself harder, see what happens, become stupider again and again, because then you are interacting precisely with this engine of the inaccessible God. In the simplest of ways, there's no need to create large fancy temples. Even in the Bible, everybody says that it's not the richest guys who get to pay for the biggest temples that get to go to heaven. There's a different style of relationship. Style is the right word. Deleuze called himself a philosopher of style. It's the way, it's the attitude, the way that one
That's
performs the
very
process.
important when coming to confront the big picture, big history philosophers, right? If you take something like the Ken Wilber model, it's very important to realize that these layers of increasing integrated complexity, these are layers of style, not layers of content, because any content that's created can then be used by any level, right? So I would always say this, talking about integral art, right? What's more spirit? What's a higher level art? Is it Van Gogh's painting of a dirt field, or is it my drawing of the Buddha? It's clearly Van Gogh, because it's not about the content that's being represented. It's about the style of the representation, right? Modernism, postmodernism, it's not about what they're talking about. It's about how they're doing it.
Wow, that's incredible. And I remember, I go back to this footage of old Deleuze speaking about style, and obviously he was a guy with a unique style, but in the style, in the appearance of thought itself made itself apparent. There's a deeply Hegelian, Zizekian point in there, isn't there?
Well, there's a thwart in understanding style. In what's L'Abécédaire that Deleuze was on French TV, right? He says style is that quality possessed by those of whom we say they have no style, right? Because if we could recognize it, it wouldn't be style yet. It would just be a fashion. In order for it to be style, it has to be disruptive of what we currently think style is. So to find more style, to find your style, you have to access that thwart.
I love it. So it's like the ones who actually have style and are just followers of fashions are actually the ones who don't have it.
Exactly. If you see a bunch of stylish celebrities, you know they don't really have any style. If you see one guy and you're like, I don't know what the fuck that is, that guy probably has style.
Which is why I'm so cringe. I cringe when people say I'm a this or I'm a that. When it comes to like schools of thought. No. I mean, sure, scaffolds, fine. We're all like making points to each other, and like there's conversations that need to happen. We need to have some overviews, but like for the benefit of the process and for the benefit of the energy that needs to be transmitted and the intensities that need to take place for something vital to happen, fuck form, fuck context.
But
it's sometimes convenient to play an identity, but if you really want to be in the extended liminal web or whatever community culture we're setting up here, you can't be an anything. You have to be the shamanic protean shapeshifter who's capable of using and moving between them, and really capable of understanding that strange liminal intensity thwart that exists between parallax, overlapping, conflicting understandings of reality. That's the skill we have to get way better at, and that we should expect of each other if we're going to be participating in this space together.
You're right.
All right, Owen, were you going to say something?
Yeah, well, I mean, all I was going to say is that, and I think you actually nailed it, Layman, about there was definitely a time in my history where I was seeking that identity. There was this sense of like, I need to find what I am, or finding a community and being like, this is what I am. So it was heavy metal. And then for a little bit, 12-step addiction recovery. So I found the thing. But then eventually I did that enough times and it's like, no, that there's always a hole in it.
When I was younger, I was so individualistic that I would worry that I was too individualistic and maybe I should become more collectivist, right? So then I would join groups so that I wouldn't be so individualistic. But of course, the people in the groups didn't join for that reason. All I ended up doing was exaggerating my individuality because it's very peculiar to join a group to try to thwart your individuality, where you're coming in from a context that isn't really going to comport itself perfectly with that identity. There's always going to be something left over. You're going to remember the context that you came into this with. And it's going to be something outstanding or something that leaks outside of the identity that you're in.
There's
A little bit
something
like Buddhism in a way. Like in Buddha's ideas, you know, if thoughts are arising and passing away, you can never be perfectly identified with them. The mere fact that you've noticed that they're coming and going means there's always going to be a distance between you and whatever you're thinking about.
Incredible.
This goes back to what we were kind of touching on with the 60s as well, that there's this explosion and it immediately becomes the good people. It immediately becomes the community of people who've been touched by the explosion. And it's...
In the process sense that Daniel likes, I mean, we just have to gamble. We have to take that risk. But in the analysis version, there's something about anticipating the recapture that we have to be ready for. I don't know if you know the term counter anti-disintermediation. It's a software term.
Oh, that one. That one.
Yeah. It's my favorite big word. So if you talk to guys who were doing computer programming in the 60s, right? They'll be like, hey, we thought we were creating technologies that would disintermediate the system. We were going to get rid of all the middle people that run the system by putting the technology in everybody's hands. What we weren't ready for was that they were going to anti-disintermediate, right? That they would actively recover everything we set free by establishing new platforms that controlled the liberating technology. So what we need to do is prepare to thwart their attempt to recapture the liberating move. So we have to be ready for counter anti-disintermediation, because the anti-disintermediation is going to be coming. And if we're not ready, it simply will recapture all of our liberating attempts. So when we're going to create them, part of it is we have to be naive and just throw ourselves at it. But part of it is we have to be prepared that the system will try to take it back over as part of itself. And we need some kind of at least mood and possibly strategy for thwarting that attempt.
A willingness to die or an ability to say fuck it and burn it and start again.
Sure, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Although it's helpful in some spaces more than others, right?
Of course.
If the British Army's rolling into Scotland and there's like a guy there, it's like, as long as there's one brave Scotsman, we are free, and they just roll over him, then that's it, they're gone. So there are times when the willingness to die thwarts the system, and there are times when it serves the system. There's a situation in which Gandhi can stand in front of a tank and it's a fuck you to the British Empire and they can't do anything. But this is a Ken Wilber point. If Gandhi was standing in front of a Nazi tank, they just run him over and thank him for not fighting back.
You've just described the war bridism of the cultural movement of history. Who wins, wins. Again, we go back to the point of strength versus weakness, not in a totalizing sense that there's only those two factors. Obviously not. It's incredibly weirdly complex, but indeed the motion moves, and in the motion is precisely processed by option versus constraint, weakness versus strength. These polarities carrying themselves through the motions of history and all of that. So when you have, there are intensities. That's how I would sort of summarize it. There are intensities, and if we're smart, we identify them. And by identifying them, we're able to sort of map the framework of the demons of our world. And then
when we're building up systems, we've got to take what really happens in the world and in ourselves and in history seriously. We can't build an idealized version. Nietzsche was trying to do this, I think, right? There's nothing in Nietzsche that is opposed to development, to spirituality, to integral theory. That's all in there. But he's saying it's the same as when a thug murders someone. It's the same as when the lion eats the gazelle, right? They're all in the same spectrum. They're versions of the same move. We have to understand how that move is made, and not just think we can isolate these positive ones from the brutality and victories of history. There's lots of different ways to be strong. There's lots of different ways to be powerful, but you have to accept that they're basically the same thing as even the most brutal ones that you wouldn't like.
Precisely. And a sense of familiar incompletion takes over me right now as we reach almost 2 hours of the conversation. Because yeah, it is that circling around that incompletion, that it is the unavoidable sort of fact of these conversations, always. And that's the central quality of all of them, I feel. Chasing the fulfillment of that incompletion. So it is not like I'm trying to tee up an uptick towards the end of the conversation, a positive happy ending. No,
That's right.
Disaster porn. It's not like we're going to end.
Right. Was that my prompt to say what a pleasure it's been to be here with you guys?
Because it hasn't. It's what attention.
It's been horrible.
It's been horrible. It's been tense.
Horrible. This is the worst discussion I've ever had.
Good.
And no one's ideas are worse than Daniel's.
They're not bad enough.